Henry had been cutting hair in Pinewood for over 30 years. The barber shop, with its checkered floor and vintage barber pole spinning outside, was more than just a place to get a trim. It was a haven, a place where locals shared stories, debated the latest news, and leaned on each other during hard times. Henry loved his work, not just because it kept his hands busy, but because it allowed him to connect with people. In a town like Pinewood, where everyone knew everyone, those connections were everything. Life in Pinewood had always been simple, but the economic downturn had hit hard. Factories shut down, jobs vanished, and hope seemed to dwindle with every passing day. Henry watched as his longtime customers came in less often, not because they didn't want a haircut, but because they couldn't afford it. That's when he made a decision that would change everything. He started offering free haircuts to job seekers, reasoning that a clean look might just give someone the confidence they needed to nail an interview. It wasn't much, but it was something. One crisp autumn morning, Henry unlocked the shop as usual, flipping the sign to "Open" and setting out his tools. The scent of coffee from the cafe across the street wafted through the open window, mingling with the smell of hair tonics and shaving cream. He had just finished sweeping the floor when the bell above the door jingled softly. In walked a man Henry had never seen before. The stranger looked out of place in Pinewood. His clothes were clean but worn, and his shoes had clearly seen better days. He carried himself with a quiet unease, as though he was used to blending into the background. His eyes darted around the shop, taking in the framed photographs of Henry with smiling customers, the antique barber chair, and the wall of clippings showcasing Pinewood's history. "Morning," Henry said, setting his broom aside. "What can I do for you?" The man hesitated, his hand gripping the strap of his frayed backpack. "I heard you give free haircuts, for job seekers," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded. "That's right. Take a seat." The man sat down slowly, as though unsure if he belonged there. Up close, Henry could see the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. His name, as Henry would soon learn, was Jake. Jake explained that he'd recently moved to Pinewood, drawn by the promise of affordable housing and a fresh start. He didn't elaborate much, but Henry could tell there was more to the story. He'd seen that look before, the look of someone carrying a weight they didn't know how to share. As Henry worked, trimming and shaping Jake's overgrown hair, the two men talked. At first, the conversation was surface level: the weather, the job market, the best diner in town. But slowly, Jake began to open up. He spoke of losing his previous job in another city, of struggling to find steady work, and of the nights he spent wondering if he'd ever get back on his feet. He mentioned a daughter he hadn't seen in months, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke of her. Henry listened intently, offering words of encouragement where he could. He shared his own stories of hard times, of nights when he wasn't sure if he'd be able to keep the barbershop open. "But you keep going," Henry said. "Sometimes that's all you can do. Keep going and trust that things will get better." When the haircut was finished, Jake stared at his reflection in the mirror, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." Henry waved it off. "Just do me a favor," he said. "When you're back on your feet, help someone else who needs it. Deal?" Jake nodded, gripping Henry's hand in a firm shake. "Deal." And with that, he was gone. For the next few days, Henry thought about Jake. Something about the man lingered in his mind, a feeling he couldn't quite place. He hoped Jake would come back, if only to let him know how things were going. But as the weeks passed, there was no sign of him. Life went on, the barbershop buzzing with the usual mix of laughter, banter, and the hum of clippers. Still, Jake's story stayed with Henry, a reminder of the quiet struggles so many people faced. Then, one day, a letter arrived at the shop. It was handwritten, the envelope addressed simply to "The Barber at Pinewood." Inside was a short note. Dear Henry. Your kindness made a difference. I'll be back soon to show you just how much. A grateful client. Henry read the note several times, his mind racing. Could it be Jake? And if so, what did he mean? He tucked the letter into his pocket, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and curiosity. Days turned into weeks, and still, no one came forward to claim the note. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the bell above the door jingled again, and Jake walked in. But this time, he looked different. His clothes were new, his posture confident. He held his head high, a stark contrast to the man who had shuffled into the shop weeks earlier. Henry barely recognized him. "Jake," he exclaimed, setting down his clippers. "You're a sight for sore eyes. How've you been?" Jake grinned. "Better than I ever expected," he said. "And it's all thanks to you." Henry waved him off. "I just gave you a haircut. The rest is all you." Jake shook his head. "It's more than that. You gave me hope when I didn't have any. You reminded me that people still care. That's worth more than you know." He paused, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I have something for you," he said, handing it to Henry. Henry unfolded the paper, his eyes widening as he read. It was a proposal, written in Jake's neat handwriting. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Pinewood Community Initiative." "I've been working on this for weeks," Jake said, his voice steady. "I got the job I interviewed for, but that's just the beginning. I've been saving up, reaching out to people I know, and I want to turn your barbershop into something bigger, a place where people can come for more than just haircuts. Job training, resume workshops, counseling, you name it. A place where people can find the help they need to get back on their feet." Henry stared at the paper, his hands trembling slightly. "Jake, this is incredible. But why me?" Jake's expression softened. "Because you believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Because you've been doing this on your own for years, helping people in ways that most of us can't even imagine. This town needs someone like you to lead the way." For a moment, Henry was speechless. He looked around the shop, at the place he had poured his heart and soul into for decades. Could he really turn it into something more? Could he take this leap of faith? As Jake waited for his answer, Henry thought about the deal they'd made. Help someone else who needs it. Maybe this was his chance to do just that, on a scale he never dreamed possible. Finally, he nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Let's do it," he said. "Let's make it happen." And in that moment, the seeds of a transformation were planted, one that would change not just Henry and Jake's lives, but the entire town of Pinewood. The partnership between Henry and Jake began with a quiet resolve. For Henry, the barbershop was his life, a space he had built with his own hands and filled with decades of memories. For Jake, the barbershop represented a turning point, a place where kindness had restored his faith in people and in himself. Together, they embarked on an ambitious journey to transform the shop into something that could lift up an entire community. Jake wasn't just all talk. In the weeks following their initial conversation, he threw himself into the project with relentless energy. He tapped into his network, reaching out to friends, former colleagues, and anyone who might lend support to their vision. At first, it wasn't easy. Pinewood was a small town, and big ideas often met with skepticism. Some people questioned Jake's motives, while others doubted whether such a project could succeed in a place like Pinewood. But Jake wasn't deterred. Henry, on the other hand, approached the endeavor with a mix of excitement and trepidation. He had spent years running the barbershop as a one-man operation, and the idea of turning it into a multi-purpose community center was both exhilarating and overwhelming. He spent long nights sitting in his favorite chair by the window, sipping coffee and sketching ideas on a notepad. What would a job training station look like? How could they balance the shop's traditional services with its new mission? The questions were endless, but so was his determination. Jake and Henry decided to start by hosting a town hall meeting to present their idea to the community. They rented out the old church hall, which hadn't seen a crowd in years, and put up flyers all over town. On the night of the meeting, Henry paced nervously near the podium as Jake set up a projector. Slowly, the room began to fill. Familiar faces from the barbershop sat shoulder to shoulder with curious strangers, all waiting to hear what the barber and the newcomer had to say. When it was time to speak, Henry took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. He wasn't a natural public speaker, but he spoke from the heart. He shared stories of the countless people who had sat in his chair over the years, people who had faced hard times and walked out of the shop with a little more confidence. He talked about the importance of community, about how even small acts of kindness could make a big difference. By the time he finished, the room was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on him. Then Jake took the stage. With the ease of someone used to commanding attention, he laid out their vision, a place where people could get a haircut, learn new skills, build resumes, and connect with others who could help them on their journey. He showed slides of their plans, how they would remodel the shop, what services they would offer, and how they would fund the project. He spoke with passion, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who truly believed in what he was saying. When Jake finished, the room erupted into applause. But as the excitement settled, the questions began. A man in the back raised his hand. "How are you going to pay for all this?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Jake smiled. "I've already secured some initial funding," he said, "and I'm willing to invest my own money to get this off the ground. But we'll also need community support, donations, volunteers, and partnerships. This isn't just our project, it's Pinewood's project." Another voice chimed in. "What if it doesn't work? What if people don't show up?" Henry stepped forward. "It's a risk," he admitted. "But isn't it worth taking? If we don't try, nothing will change. And if we succeed, we can make a real difference, not just for individuals, but for the entire town." The questions continued, but by the end of the night, a sense of cautious optimism had taken hold. People lingered after the meeting, approaching Jake and Henry with ideas, offers of help, and words of encouragement. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Over the next few weeks, the project began to take shape. Jake used his connections to bring in a team of volunteers, including a retired carpenter who offered to help with the renovations and a graphic designer who created a sleek new logo for the community center. Henry's customers pitched in as well, donating money, tools, and even their time. One man, a former contractor, offered to install a new set of shelves for free. "I owe you for all those free haircuts," he said with a grin. The transformation of the barbershop was nothing short of remarkable. The old, creaky chairs were replaced with sleek, modern ones. A corner of the shop was converted into a resource center, complete with computers for job searches and a bulletin board filled with local job postings. Another section was turned into a small classroom, where volunteers could teach everything from resume writing to interview skills. But Henry insisted on keeping the heart of the shop intact. The vintage barber pole still spun outside, and the familiar smell of shaving cream and aftershave still filled the air. As the opening day approached, excitement in Pinewood grew. Local newspapers ran stories about the project, and word spread to neighboring towns. Jake even managed to secure a small grant from a regional nonprofit, which helped cover the cost of equipment and supplies. For Henry, it was both exhilarating and humbling to see the community rallying around their vision. The night before the grand opening, Henry stayed late at the shop, making sure everything was perfect. As he adjusted a stack of freshly printed brochures, Jake walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Nervous?" he asked, handing one to Henry. "A little," Henry admitted. "This is all so much bigger than I ever imagined." Jake nodded. "It is. But it's also exactly what this town needs. And it wouldn't have happened without you. Henry looked around the shop, taking in the transformation. I just hope it makes a difference, he said quietly. Jake smiled. It already has. The next morning, the shop was packed with people. Friends, neighbors, and curious onlookers filled the space, admiring the renovations and signing up for workshops. Local business owners stopped by to offer support, and a reporter from the regional news station interviewed Henry and Jake. As Henry gave the first haircut of the day, a trim for a young man preparing for a big interview, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. The Pinewood Community Initiative was officially underway, and it was already changing lives. But neither Henry nor Jake could have predicted just how far-reaching the impact would be, or the challenges that still lay ahead. The grand opening of the Pinewood Community Initiative had gone better than anyone could have hoped. Henry and Jake were overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from the townspeople and even neighboring communities. It was as if Pinewood had been holding its breath, waiting for something to bring it back to life. The barbershop, now a hub for hope and opportunity, buzzed with a new kind of energy. In the first few weeks, the initiative gained momentum quickly. The Resource Center saw a steady stream of visitors, job seekers typing away at resumes, attending workshops, and practicing mock interviews. Volunteers from Pinewood and beyond offered their expertise. A retired HR manager held weekly sessions on interview tips, while a young tech-savvy college graduate taught basic computer skills. The classroom corner became a hub of activity, with people of all ages eager to learn. Henry found himself busier than ever. The barber chair remained at the heart of the shop, and Henry continued cutting hair, but now his role expanded far beyond trimming and styling. People came to him not just for haircuts but for advice, encouragement, and the quiet reassurance that they weren't alone. It was a role he embraced, even as it stretched him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Jake, on the other hand, became the face of the initiative. His charisma and knack for networking opened doors that Henry hadn't even known existed. He secured partnerships with local businesses willing to hire directly from the center's pool of job seekers. He persuaded a nearby grocery store to donate food for a monthly community dinner held at the shop, an event that quickly became a favorite among residents. But as the initiative grew, so did the challenges. One morning, Henry arrived at the shop to find Jake sitting at a table, his head buried in his hands. Papers were scattered everywhere, spreadsheets, receipts, and grant applications. The normally composed and confident Jake looked utterly drained. Rough night? Henry asked, pouring them both a cup of coffee. Jake looked up with a weary smile. You could say that. We've got more people coming through the doors than we ever expected, which is great. But the bills are piling up, and some of our funding sources are drying up faster than I thought. Henry sat down across from him. What can we do? Jake sighed. I'm working on it. I've reached out to a few more potential donors, and I'm putting together another grant proposal. But we need to start thinking about sustainability, how to keep this going long-term. Henry nodded thoughtfully. We'll figure it out. We've come this far, haven't we? Jake managed a small smile. Yeah. We have. Despite the financial strain, neither man was willing to give up. They tightened their budget, cut unnecessary expenses, and focused on the programs that had the most impact. Jake threw himself into fundraising efforts, organizing events like charity auctions and community drives. Henry, meanwhile, continued doing what he did best, building relationships, one conversation at a time. But just as they started to find their footing, an unexpected twist threatened to derail everything. One afternoon, a man in an expensive suit walked into the shop. He introduced himself as Richard, a representative from a prominent law firm. His tone was polite, but there was an edge to his demeanor that put Henry on alert. I represent the owners of this property, Richard began. I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news. The property has been sold to a development company, and they're planning to build a new shopping center here. You'll need to vacate the premises within 60 days. The words hit Henry like a punch to the gut. Sold? But this building's been in the same family for generations. I know the owner personally. Richard shrugged. Times change. The deal has already gone through. I suggest you start making arrangements. As the man left, Henry sat down heavily in his chair, his mind racing. The shop wasn't just a building, it was the heart of everything they'd built, the place where it all began. Losing it felt unthinkable. When Jake returned later that day, Henry broke the news. Jake's jaw tightened as he listened, and for the first time, Henry saw a flash of anger in his usually calm demeanor. They can't do this, Jake said firmly. This place means too much to too many people. We've got 60 days, Henry said quietly. What do we do? Jake's mind was already working. We fight. We rally the community, we petition the developers, we make as much noise as we can. They need to know that this isn't just a building, it's a lifeline. Over the next few weeks, Henry and Jake launched a campaign to save the shop. They organized protests, collected signatures, and held press conferences. Local media picked up the story, and soon the fight to save the Pinewood Community Initiative became a rallying cry for the town. The response was overwhelming. People who had benefited from the initiative shared their stories, speaking passionately about how the shop had changed their lives. A single mother talked about how she'd landed a job after attending one of the workshops. An elderly man tearfully described how the monthly community dinners had given him a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. But the developers were unmoved. They saw the shop as nothing more than a piece of real estate, a prime location for their new project. As the deadline approached, the tension in Pinewood grew. Henry and Jake refused to give up, but the odds seemed stacked against them. Then, on the eve of the final deadline, an unexpected ally stepped forward. A woman named Eleanor arrived at the shop unannounced. She introduced herself as the granddaughter of the building's original owner. She explained that she had only recently learned about the sale and was appalled by what was happening. This building was never supposed to be sold, Eleanor said firmly. My grandfather left it in our family's care with the understanding that it would serve the community. I intend to honor his wishes. Eleanor had the resources and legal expertise to challenge the sale, and she wasted no time in doing so. With her help, the deal was overturned, and the building was returned to its original purpose. The developers backed down, and the shop was saved. The victory was bittersweet. Henry and Jake were relieved and grateful, but the experience had taken a toll on them both. For Henry, it was a reminder of how fragile their work could be. For Jake, it was a call to action, a realization that they needed to build something even stronger, something that couldn't be threatened so easily. In the weeks that followed, they redoubled their efforts to secure long-term funding and expand their programs. Jake reached out to national organizations, seeking partnerships that could bring additional resources to Pinewood. Henry, meanwhile, focused on building deeper connections within the community, ensuring that everyone felt a sense of ownership in the initiative. The Pinewood Community Initiative had weathered its first major storm and emerged stronger, but the challenges were far from over. While the victory against the developers brought a sense of relief, it also cast a spotlight on the shop and its mission. The attention drew not only support but also scrutiny, forcing Henry and Jake to navigate an increasingly complex landscape of expectations, responsibilities, and unforeseen complications. In the weeks following the legal battle, the shop became a beacon of hope for Pinewood and beyond. People traveled from neighboring towns to see the transformed barbershop that had become a community lifeline. Local newspapers ran feature stories, and regional news channels covered their story, painting Henry and Jake as heroes. The influx of attention brought a wave of donations and volunteers, but it also attracted critics. Some residents of Pinewood began to voice concerns. The shop's newfound popularity meant longer lines and fewer resources for locals who had relied on it before the transformation. Henry overheard whispers of frustration as he worked, the familiar hum of the clippers accompanied by murmurs of resentment. "It's great what they're doing," one man said, "but it feels like they've forgotten about us regulars." Those words stuck with Henry, weighing on him as he closed up shop each night. By the end of the year, the Pinewood Community Initiative was not just surviving, it was thriving. And through it all, Henry and Jake never lost sight of the simple idea that had brought them together, the belief that a single act of kindness could change everything. Jake, too, faced mounting pressure. As the face of the initiative, he was inundated with emails, phone calls, and meeting requests from people wanting to collaborate or pitch ideas. What had started as a grassroots effort to help Pinewood's residents was now seen as a model for community development, and Jake found himself pulled in a dozen different directions. He tried to stay focused on their original mission, but the demands of growth threatened to stretch them thin. The strain began to show in their partnership. Henry, used to the steady rhythm of his barbershop life, grew frustrated with the constant changes and disruptions. He missed the simplicity of cutting hair and listening to people's stories, the quiet moments that had always defined his work. Jake, on the other hand, thrived on the chaos, his mind constantly buzzing with new ideas and possibilities. Their differences, once complementary, now felt like opposing forces pulling them apart. The tension came to a head one evening after a particularly chaotic day. A miscommunication had led to two separate workshops being scheduled at the same time, resulting in a packed shop and a lot of unhappy participants. After everyone had gone home, Henry confronted Jake as they cleaned up the mess. "This isn't what I signed up for," Henry said, his voice tired but firm. "I wanted to help people, not run a circus." Jake, equally exhausted, snapped back. "And I'm trying to make sure we can keep helping people, Henry. You think this is easy? Every day I'm fighting to keep this place running, and all you do is complain about how things have changed." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Henry shook his head and walked out, leaving Jake alone in the empty shop. For the next few days, the tension between them lingered. They worked side by side but spoke only when necessary, the easy camaraderie they once shared replaced by a strained silence. The volunteers and regulars noticed the shift, their questions met with forced smiles and vague reassurances. It wasn't until a quiet Saturday morning that the ice began to thaw. Henry was sweeping the floor when a young woman walked in. She looked nervous, clutching a piece of paper in her hands. "Is this the place where you help people find jobs?" she asked. Henry set the broom aside and nodded. "That's right. How can we help?" The woman hesitated, then handed him the paper. It was a job application, half filled out and crumpled from being carried around. I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I dropped out of high school, and I've never had a real job before." Henry glanced at the application, then back at the woman. She couldn't have been more than 20, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "Why don't you have a seat?" he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "We'll figure it out together." As he worked with her, guiding her through the application and offering tips on how to present herself to employers, Henry felt a familiar sense of purpose. This was why he'd started giving free haircuts all those years ago, to help people like her, to remind them that they mattered. When they finished, the woman thanked him, tears in her eyes. "You have no idea how much this means to me," she said. After she left, Henry sat alone in the shop, the weight of his earlier argument with Jake pressing on him. He realized that they were both right in their own ways. The initiative had grown in ways he hadn't anticipated, and it was overwhelming. But it was also doing exactly what it was meant to do, changing lives, one person at a time. That evening, Henry called Jake. "Can you come by the shop?" he asked. "We need to talk." When Jake arrived, Henry was waiting with 2 cups of coffee and a stack of old photos. He handed one to Jake, a picture of the barbershop on its opening day, decades earlier. "This place has always been about people," Henry said. "That's what I lost sight of. And I think, maybe, you have too." Jake studied the photo, his expression softening. "I know I've been pushing too hard," he admitted. I don't want to let anyone down." "You're not," Henry said. "But we can't help everyone, Jake. We have to focus on what we do best and trust that it'll be enough." They talked late into the night, hashing out their frustrations and finding common ground. By the time they finished, the tension between them had eased, replaced by a renewed sense of partnership. They agreed to scale back some of the more ambitious plans and refocus on the core mission of the initiative, helping the people of Pinewood. The changes brought a sense of balance back to the shop. The workshops became more manageable, the resource center more organized, and the volunteers more engaged. Henry and Jake worked together seamlessly, their partnership stronger for having weathered the storm. The community noticed the difference, and the shop once again felt like the welcoming, transformative space it was meant to be. But the challenges weren't over. Just as they began to settle into their new rhythm, another twist would test them in ways they never expected, one that would push the Pinewood Community Initiative to its limits and force Henry and Jake to make a choice that would define their legacy forever. The Pinewood Community Initiative was thriving in a way that Henry and Jake could hardly have imagined when they first set out on this journey. The barbershop was no longer just a barbershop, it was a sanctuary for hope, a place where people came not only to reshape their outward appearance but to reclaim their sense of self-worth. The streamlined programs and renewed focus on Pinewood's residents brought a sense of balance back to the shop. People trusted in what they were doing, and the town had started to heal in small but meaningful ways. One crisp morning, as Henry prepared for the day, Jake came into the shop with a look that Henry had come to recognize, a mix of excitement and hesitation. Jake carried a folder under his arm, which he set on the counter as he sat down. "What's this?" Henry asked, tilting his head toward the folder. Jake took a deep breath before answering. "An opportunity," he said. "But it's big. Bigger than anything we've done before." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Bigger how?" Jake opened the folder and slid a sheet of paper toward Henry. It was a letter from a foundation headquartered in the city, one that supported community development projects across the state. The letter detailed an offer. The foundation had heard about the Pinewood Community Initiative and was impressed by its impact. They wanted to partner with Henry and Jake to replicate their model in other struggling towns. The catch? It would require scaling up the operation significantly, which meant more resources, more staff, and, most importantly, more time. "They want us to present our vision at their annual conference," Jake explained, his voice laced with both excitement and anxiety. "If they like what they see, they're willing to fund the expansion." Henry leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the words sink in. Expanding the initiative sounded like a dream on paper, but it also sounded exhausting. Henry loved his barbershop and his community, but he wasn't sure he wanted to take on more responsibility. He'd already seen how the demands of running the initiative had strained their partnership and his own peace of mind. "I don't know, Jake," Henry said finally. "What we've got here works. I'm not sure I want to risk losing that." Jake leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I get it, Henry. I do. But think about how many more people we could help. What we've built here, it's special. And it could be the blueprint for something much bigger." Henry sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Let me think about it." Over the next few days, Henry couldn't stop thinking about the proposal. He saw the faces of the people who had come through the shop, each one carrying their own story of struggle and resilience. He thought about Jake's relentless drive to make a difference and about his own doubts and fears. Was he holding Jake back? Or was he the one keeping their work grounded in reality? While Henry wrestled with the decision, life in the shop went on. One afternoon, a man named Marcus came in for a haircut. Marcus had been a regular at the shop for years, a soft-spoken factory worker who rarely said much beyond pleasantries. But that day, as Henry trimmed his hair, Marcus began to talk. "I wanted to thank you," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "For everything you and Jake have done." Henry paused, his scissors hovering mid-air. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked down at his hands. "My son. He's been coming to the workshops here. He was lost, Henry. After he dropped out of school, I didn't know what to do with him. But he came here, and something clicked. He's got a job now, his first real job, and he's proud of himself. I haven't seen him like this in years." Henry felt a lump in his throat. "That's all him, Marcus," he said quietly. "We just gave him a place to start." "Maybe," Marcus replied. "But you gave him something no one else did, a chance." That conversation stayed with Henry long after Marcus left. It reminded him of why they had started this journey in the first place and why it mattered. That evening, as he locked up the shop, he called Jake. "Let's do it," Henry said simply. Jake didn't need to ask what he meant. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Henry replied. "But we do it our way. No cutting corners, no losing sight of what's important." Jake's voice was filled with relief. "Deal." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Jake and Henry worked late into the night, crafting their presentation for the Foundation's conference. They pored over data, gathered testimonials, and practiced their pitch until they knew it by heart. For Henry, it was a crash course in public speaking, and though he dreaded standing in front of a crowd, he knew it was necessary. When the day of the conference arrived, Henry felt a mix of nerves and determination. The event was held in a sleek, modern auditorium in the city, a far cry from the cozy confines of the barbershop. As he and Jake walked onto the stage, the spotlight blindingly bright, Henry took a deep breath and focused on the faces in the audience. Jake started the presentation, his confidence shining through as he told the story of the Pinewood Community Initiative. He spoke about the challenges they'd faced, the lives they'd touched, and the vision for the future. Then it was Henry's turn. His hands trembled as he gripped the microphone. But as he began to speak, the words came naturally. "I'm just a barber," Henry said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I've spent my life cutting hair and listening to people's stories. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that everyone needs someone to believe in them. That's what we've tried to do in Pinewood, remind people that they're not alone, that they're worth believing in. And that's what we want to bring to other communities." The room was silent as he spoke, the audience hanging on every word. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. A few days later, Jake received a call from the foundation. They had been awarded the funding. The news brought a wave of emotions. Jake was ecstatic, already diving into plans for expansion, while Henry felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. The road ahead would be even more demanding than what they had faced so far, but Henry was ready to face it with Jake by his side. Back in Pinewood, the announcement was met with celebration. The town, which had once been defined by its struggles, now saw itself as a beacon of hope. And for Henry and Jake, the journey was just beginning. Together, they had proven that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating waves of change far beyond what they had ever imagined. The announcement of the Pinewood Community Initiative's expansion was met with both celebration and trepidation. While the news brought hope to many, it also brought a heightened sense of responsibility for Henry and Jake. For Jake, the funding was a green light to chase his vision of helping more towns like Pinewood. For Henry, it was a humbling reminder of how much their small idea had grown. Together, they faced a new chapter, one that promised to be as challenging as it was rewarding. In the weeks that followed, the barbershop became a hive of activity. Meetings with architects, local leaders, and volunteers filled the days, while nights were spent poring over plans and budgets. The foundation's funding came with stipulations, a clear timeline for the project, measurable goals, and regular progress reports. It was the kind of structured accountability that Jake thrived on but made Henry uneasy. He had always trusted his instincts and relationships more than paperwork and deadlines. Despite the growing workload, the shop's core mission remained intact. People continued to walk through its doors seeking guidance, hope, and community. Among them was Claire, a single mother in her early 30s who had recently lost her job at a local diner. She had heard about the initiative from a friend and came in one afternoon, clutching a crumpled resume and looking utterly defeated. Henry greeted her with his usual warmth and guided her to the resource center. As she sat down at one of the computers, he noticed her struggling to navigate the job application websites. Without hesitation, he pulled up a chair beside her and walked her through the process, sharing tips and encouraging her every step of the way. By the end of the afternoon, Claire had applied to 3 positions and left with a sense of renewed confidence. That evening, as Henry reflected on the day, he realized something profound. While the expansion was exciting and necessary, the heart of their work would always be in these one-on-one moments. It wasn't about building something grand, it was about making people feel seen and valued. Jake, meanwhile, was knee-deep in the logistics of expansion. The foundation's funding allowed them to hire a small team, including a program coordinator and a part-time social worker. Jake traveled to neighboring towns to scout potential locations for new community centers, each visit reinforcing his belief that the Pinewood model could work elsewhere. But with every step forward, he encountered resistance, bureaucratic red tape, skeptical local leaders, and communities wary of outsiders coming in with big ideas. One particularly challenging day, Jake returned to Pinewood visibly frustrated. He vented to Henry about the endless obstacles, his voice tinged with doubt. "Maybe we're biting off more than we can chew," he admitted. "It feels like for every step forward, we're pushed 2 steps back." Henry listened quietly before responding. "You remember what you told me when we first started this? We just have to keep going. That's all we can do, Jake. One step at a time." Jake nodded, taking comfort in Henry's steady presence. It was a reminder of why they worked so well together, Jake's vision and drive balanced by Henry's grounded wisdom. As the months passed, the expansion efforts began to take shape. The first new center opened in a struggling mill town about 30 miles from Pinewood. It was smaller than the original barbershop but had the same welcoming atmosphere. Henry and Jake attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony, their hearts swelling with pride as the first visitors walked through the doors. But success didn't come without sacrifice. The demands of managing multiple locations took Jake away from Pinewood more often than he liked, and Henry found himself taking on more responsibilities at the original shop. The distance tested their partnership, and there were moments when the weight of it all threatened to pull them apart. Yet, each time they reached a breaking point, they found their way back to the shared belief that had brought them together, the power of kindness to change lives. One day, while Jake was away at a meeting, a familiar face walked into the Pinewood shop. It was Marcus, the factory worker whose son had found a job through the initiative. This time, Marcus wasn't alone. He brought his son, now a confident young man dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and holding a folder of papers. "Henry," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is all because of you." Henry waved off the praise, but Marcus insisted. "No, really. You didn't just help my son. You saved our family." The young man handed Henry the folder. Inside was a letter of acceptance to a trade school, along with a scholarship award. "I wouldn't have even applied if it weren't for this place," he said. "You believed in me when no one else did." Henry felt tears welling up as he hugged them both. Moments like these reminded him why the work mattered, why it was worth every sleepless night and difficult decision. As the years passed, the Pinewood Community Initiative grew into something much larger than Henry or Jake had ever imagined. They established centers in 6 towns, each one modeled after the original shop but tailored to the unique needs of its community. They trained local leaders to run the centers, ensuring that the work would continue even if Henry and Jake weren't there. Back in Pinewood, the barbershop remained the heart of it all. Henry still cut hair most days, finding joy in the simple act of making people feel good about themselves. Jake, though often traveling, made it a point to return regularly, reconnecting with the place and the people who had started it all. One quiet evening, as Henry was closing up the shop, Jake walked in. They sat together in the empty shop, sipping coffee and reflecting on how far they had come. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Jake asked. "When I walked in here, desperate for a haircut and a little hope?" Henry chuckled. "I think about it all the time. You were a mess." Jake laughed, shaking his head. "And now look at us. We've done so much, but it still feels like there's more to do." "There always will be," Henry said. "But that's the beauty of it. We're not here to fix everything. We're here to do what we can, where we can." Jake nodded, a quiet smile on his face. "You know, Henry, you've changed my life." Henry looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "No, Jake. We changed each other's lives. And that's how it's supposed to be." As the two men sat together, the lights of the shop casting a warm glow around them, they knew that their journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always be new opportunities, and always be people in need of a little hope. But as long as they kept going, they could face whatever came next. And in the hearts of the people they had touched, those who had found jobs, rebuilt their lives, and rediscovered their worth, their legacy would live on, a testament to the power of kindness to transform not just individuals, but entire communities.